Okay, so what's gut feel? I started out as how you can make better business decisions, then I decided, having sort of gone through it, just better decisions.
May I ask something?
Yes.
Could you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm Simon. I'm a .NET developer, and I've been working for myself for 6 and a bit years. And before that, I worked for somebody else, but I worked very autonomously. So when I started working for myself, my situation didn't change much. So I've spent a long time working for myself, effectively. And for a long time, John will tell you, for a long time I've been talking about how when you work for yourself and when you work within small businesses, you do a lot of stuff by the seat of your pants, by gut feel. I kind of got to think, well, maybe there is something to that. Maybe that's not just me winging it all the time. Maybe I know what I'm doing sometimes. I was talking to a friend of mine a little while ago, and he said, you need to read this book. And I'll tell you about the book at the end. I'll tell you the title of the book at the end. But I got to reading this book, and it kind of confirmed a lot of what I thought I knew. So I thought, okay, well, I'll do the talk. And Mark contacted me a little while ago and said, right, stop talking about your talk and actually do it. So here it is.
Thanks.
Thank you. So, gut feel, intuition, sixth sense, instinct, call it what you will. We all experience unconscious visceral reactions to situations. Some of us are more in tune with those feelings, but how many of us really trust them and act on them, integrate them into our decision-making processes? Perhaps we just go with our gut feel, or perhaps we kind of run in the opposite direction and say, well, think about this, we need to analyse this situation and deal with it properly. So, a little bit of structure, what, why and how. What's going on in our nervous system when we make a snap judgment? Why should we give more credence to our intuitive responses? Why it's not just winging it? And how can we integrate our instinctive responses in order to make better decisions? So how can we use that? So the what? It's all about our rational mind versus our emotional mind. We taught that rational analytical mind ruling over emotion is the way to go. From Plato to Descartes to Francis Bacon and Freud, it's all about, Plato talks about the charioteer controlling. Charioteer is the rational mind controlling the horses, which need to be kept in check because the emotions will run wild if not controlled. Desire versus reason. Roman poet Ovid wrote about Cupid's arrow, and the quote, "I'm dragged along by a strange new force. Desire and reason are pulling in different directions. I see the right way and approve it, but I follow the wrong." All about her love for Jason conflicting with her sense of duty for her father. And again, that dichotomy, that split between the two parts of our mind, if you like. Human versus animal. We tend to think of it as our emotional mind is a kind of base desire, as violent and impulsive, whereas our analytical mind has to kind of keep a check on that. You've got the idea of mind as computer. It's a big thing in the way that we think about the way our mind works. Cognitive psychology gave birth to the idea of artificial intelligence, and for a long time our approach to artificial intelligence was kind of flawed and limited because you can't code emotions in the way that you can code logic. That's changing now. The way that artificial intelligence is approached is very different, and it's much more adaptive and mirrors a lot of the ways that we think that our brain works. Don't judge a book by its cover. Like, we use that expression all the time, and it says to us, don't just trust your first reaction, your snap judgment, your instinctive reaction to something. You've got to analyse the variables, you've got to eliminate the emotion, and make this kind of perfectly rational decision based on all the information available. So, a little bit of neurology. I'm going to use triune brain model. Disclaimer, all of the neurology here is at best kind of oversimplified at worst, just plain wrong. So if anybody is strong on neurology, you're probably going to pick holes in it. But the triune brain model is based around the evolution of the brain. It developed in the 60s and it's kind of been superseded and a lot of it proven wrong, but it's quite a good framework for what we're talking about. So you've got the idea is the parts of the brain as they evolved. So the oldest part of the brain, the reptilian brain, the brain stem you see in the middle there, responsible for basic survival functions, things like breathing, hunger, thirst, sexual desire, and so on. Then later on developed the limbic system, sometimes known as the mammalian brain. Our emotional responses, fear, happiness, anger, pretty much any emotion that you can name. Really interesting thing about the limbic system. When we smell a smell and it evokes a really strong memory, it's because part of the pathways from our nose through our brain pass through a particular area in the limbic system and it triggers an emotional response from that, which is why you get that, wow, God, that really takes me back. And then over the top of that, you've got the neocortex, the bit that we think of as making us human, raising us above the animals, if you like, our rational brain, which does all of these clever things that we can do: reflection, problem resolution, differentiation between our thoughts and emotions, curious, self-referential quality of thinking about thinking that until quite recently we thought was a solely human thing. We're starting to learn that that's not really the case, but it's certainly not present in a lot of animals. So the dopamine system is a really, really big part of how our emotions work and how we respond to situations. Dopamine's a chemical, it's a neurotransmitter, it's the feel-good chemical, it's the thing that's responsible for that rush of joy when something good happens, when we feel excited and so on. The dopamine system has evolved to help us find rewards at basic level. It's finding the tree that's got the beehive in it where we get the honey from. And the rush of dopamine makes us want to repeat that experience. It helps us to remember where that tree was and so on. Your brain is plastic, neuroplasticity, fascinating concept. The brain is constantly rewiring in response to stuff that's happened to us and stuff that we've found and so on. My favourite neuroplasticity fact: when you're trying to remember the name of a film, you go, oh, it's right there. It had that guy in it, and it's right on the tip of your tongue. And 20 minutes later, you remember it like it was always there, because it was always there. That memory was always there, but because you hadn't used it recently, your brain had broken down the connections to it because it was expensive to maintain those connections. But in that time you started trying to remember it, your brain has rebuilt those connections. The structure of your brain has changed, and there it is again. Absolutely brilliant.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay.
When I said, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? And you said, I'm a kind of one-man band. I've got, and I do .com website type stuff. And then you're talking about this like you're an expert. So the two things, you must have missed something out about yourself. How do you know all about this? Did you study this?
No, I'm just interested really. I've read a lot, particularly in the last couple of weeks. I'm frantically writing slides. And it's just stuff that interests me. And I like to read. I like to read a mix of fiction and non-fiction. So I suppose that's where I kind of picked it up from. But it's not something I train. I mean, I left school at 17. I bumped out my A levels and went out to work, and was very fortunate to fall into a job that I loved and built websites when websites were really, really bad. But yeah, it's just stuff that kind of gets me fired up. So you all know the story of Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov rang a bell before he fed the dogs, and the dogs salivated when they got food, and then after a while they salivated when they heard the bell, because they've been conditioned to associate that bell with the arrival of food. Turns out it wasn't actually a bell, but that's a whole other talk. So what you get here is that the dopamine system forms the basis of an exquisite pattern matching system. It allows us to recognise stuff in our environment and in the outside world and match it to things that have happened to us before, and do this kind of heuristic matching, quite complex association with things. Really interesting description of this in one of the books. Experienced bird watchers are able to identify a bird from a long way away. You know, you're right, I don't know if there are any bird watchers here, I'm not one, but most people, in order to identify a bird, would have to kind of look at it and go, well, it's this colour and it's this shape, and use one of the kind of guides that's online that allow you to do that. An experienced bird watcher, apparently, what they do is they see what's called the gist of the bird, G-I-S-S, and it's just a series of patterns and shapes created as the bird flies and it turns its head and so on, that their brain is matching to a bunch of patterns in their experience and very, very quickly processing that information and giving an answer to the question, if you like. Dopamine neurons generate signals based on expectations, so when we walk into a building that we recognise, our dopamine system is recognising that and it's starting to generate those kinds of signals to allow us to know what to expect. It's a bit like if this, then that. You know, it's a very oversimplification, but yeah, effectively. An interesting thing about this is that unpredictable rewards, things that we don't expect to happen that do happen, are 3 to 4 times more exciting for our dopamine system. Really fires up the dopamine system. And I'll talk a little bit later about this, but fruit machines, for example, one of the reasons why gambling is so addictive is because of the action on our dopamine system. When we win, we haven't expected to win, and that really fires up our brain and encourages it to try and repeat that experience. So the flip side of that feel-good aspect of it is the bad side of it. Something called a prediction error signal. So when we're expecting an outcome, like Pavlov's dogs, they hear the bell ring and then no food arrives, you get this prediction error signal, which is very, very powerful. The dopamine system decreases its firing rate and we experience the opposite of feel good. We experience a disappointment. And that's very, very powerful for the brain. Nothing focuses the mind like surprise. Part of the brain that's really, really key in this is something called the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, and it's really important in amplifying that experience of disappointment across the whole brain. It generates a unique electrical signal called error-related negativity, which sounds very fancy, but in psychology circles is also known as the oh shit circuit. That experience we've all had when something goes wrong. A good friend of mine used to call it doing a pooper, when you realised you've just deleted the live database and your whole gut just south by 6 inches. And the ACC is quite widely connected within the brain. It's connected to the thalamus, which is an area associated with attention, and so what that does is allows us to focus our attention very, very quickly. We hear a loud bang, we're on it. What's that? Is it a gunshot kind of thing? It's also connected to the hypothalamus, which is an area regulates bodily functions like heart rate, adrenaline. It gears the body to react quickly to a situation. It's the area that's responsible for sweaty palms and racing heart. It communicates urgency to the rest of your body. Something's gone wrong here. We've got to act quickly. It's also responsible for adjusting our expectations, so it remembers what the dopamine system just learned. So if the food doesn't arrive when the bell rings, then the ACC is really key to adjusting those patterns in order that next time the bell rings, we're not so keen for the food to arrive. The speedy, another really interesting aspect of this is the spindle neurons. So most neurons are short and bushy. Spindle neurons are long and thin, and they conduct faster than any other neuron within the brain. And those spindle neurons radiate out from the ACC across the whole brain, so what that enables it to do is broadcast that experience across the whole brain and recruit the whole brain to act based on what's just happened, rapidly saturating the entire cortex. More neurology. Also frontal cortex, the OFC, It's a small area which sits just behind your eyes, hence the name. And it's responsible for integrating visceral emotions into conscious decision-making process. So those instinctive reactions we have, it bubbles them up into our thinking brain so that we can then go, okay, what's going on there? Without it, people can't make the simplest decisions. There's a neurologist called Antonio Damasio, and he had a patient come to him, a guy called Elliot, who'd had a tumour removed from this area, and when he recovered from the surgery, he became cold and emotionless, and he changed, his personality changed. And he ended up seeing Damasio, and what he did was, he studied him, he talked to him, and one of the things he did was to show him emotive pictures like a severed foot or a burning house or a naked one, pictures which would evoke a strong emotional response in most people. And he didn't experience an emotional response to those. And not only was he not consciously experiencing a response, what Damasio did was wire him up to a lie detector to measure his heart rate, his blood pressure, his galvanic skin response, whether his hands were sweating or not, and found that his body genuinely didn't respond to those stimuli. He wasn't excited in any way by them. But the really interesting thing is what he found was that he couldn't make the simplest decisions. So he couldn't choose whether to use a red pen or a blue pen. He couldn't choose whether his next appointment should be on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. He couldn't choose between two restaurants. He could endlessly enumerate all of the pros and cons of the different options and to and fro, and would go as far as driving to each restaurant to see how busy it was. But he was completely unable to just go, don't want to do it, I'll have a blue pen, it doesn't matter, because he didn't have that connection between his emotional brain and his rational brain. So you can see, it says there, Damasio then went on to study other people with similar damage, either through tumour or genetic damage, and found the same thing. People had the same problem if that area of the brain didn't function. And that makes a lie of Plato's idea of this perfectly rational decision where we eliminate all emotion, we make a cold, irrational decision. It's actually impossible. If it ain't broke. So the cortex is a relatively recent addition in evolutionary terms. It's literally layered on top of the limbic system in the last few million years, just yesterday really. The cortex is very powerful. What I was saying earlier, we can use it to think about our emotions, we can reflect on, we can think about our thinking, and they're very complex things that we do. We can use language to describe causation. I climbed that tree where I usually get the honey and I got chased by a panther. But that power comes at cost. The cortex is relatively immature, and as a result it's full of bugs and design flaws, a little bit like Windows 8 when it was rushed to market. And so it's far from perfect. Whereas the dopamine system has been refined over a much longer timescale of finding food and mates and avoiding danger and so on. It's much more refined, it's much more stable. Evolution's had time to iron out the bugs. That's not to say it's perfect, but it is generally more reliable. So evolution doesn't discard anything, it still works. The dopamine system as a decision-making engine still works, and so that whilst the cortex has been layered over the top of it and then has been integrated into it, it's still a really important part of how we assess situations and make decisions about things. So why should we give more credence to our emotional responses? The cortex has its limitations. It can handle a relatively small number of variables. Depends on who you talk to. Some people say 4 variables, some people use the idea of 7, give or take 2. But it's a relatively small number of variables that it can process. And it takes time to shunt those variables around and compare and analyse them. There's some great examples in one of the books about sportsmen, American football players, quarterback taking the snap and 10 tons of muscle is heading towards him to try and flatten him. He's got a very few seconds to pick a player that he's going to throw the ball to, and we tend to think, well, he's analysing. That guy's I can't throw to him, and he's not. He looks up, he sees that guy over there, and he gets a sweaty, nervous feeling. He sees that guy over there, and it feels right, and he throws, because his conscious mind doesn't have time to crunch the numbers, doesn't have time to calculate the angles. He's using his dopamine system to see what feels right. So yeah, you can think of your cortex as a little bit like a pocket calculator. On the other hand, your dopamine system is more like a supercomputer. Can process, handles input from all of your senses and other parts of your brain, so a bunch of information that we're not even conscious of picking up on. Body language, the way that people look at us, the way that they smell, and you ever had the experience of going to a supermarket on Christmas Eve? Horrible, horrible thing. But I noticed one day that as I approached the door, as I walked in the door, I went from feeling slightly intrepidated to actually feeling really anxious. And I suddenly thought, God, that's me picking up on everyone else's pheromones, everyone else's anger and frustration that old lady won't get out of the way with her trolley. Is saturating the whole store. And I walked in and I've taken a breath of that, and my body has just gone, oh, we should be feeling like that too. So, really nice phrase that I picked up. Your dopamine system passes reality in practical terms. It grabs all those variables and breaks it up into matches against our experience, breaks it up into things that we can recognise and that we have experience of. Heuristic analysis. I squeezed the digital term in, right? Well done. And it's next, it's closest match stuff. It's not, none of this is exact matching, but it's comparing it to experience. And the more experience we have, the more we have to match situations against. Process known as thin slicing. The ability to find patterns in situations' behaviour based on very thin slices of experience. Interestingly, our judgments that we make based on thin slicing are very similar to the judgments we make when we have much more information. And there's some great examples of this. There was a study done where they recorded doctors talking to their patients. This was done in the States. They then played those conversations to people and asked them to rate whether that doctor was likely to be sued by their patients for malpractice. And what they found was that people could predict that pretty accurately. And what came out of that was that they realised that the reason why you sue your doctor is not because they were no good, it's because you didn't like them. You didn't like their tone of voice, you didn't like the way they talked down to you, you didn't like the way they interacted with you. But then the really interesting part, they then took these conversations and they took 4 10-second chunks. They compressed it, put it into a single chunk. They passed it through a content filter which takes out all the high-pitched sounds that distinguish speech. So what you end up with after that is a kind of warble which doesn't have any sense in it, but it still carries things like pitch, tone of voice, rhythm. And by playing those 40-second chunks to people, they found that they were still able to make pretty accurate assessments about whether that person was a doctor who was likely to be sued or not. So it's a great example of how we're making these assessments based on next to no information at all, or certainly not information that we're aware of. We tend to think, well, we listen to them talk and they know what they're doing because I can hear what they're saying. No, you're not. So what you then get is your supercomputer does this analysis, it does this heuristic matching, and then bubbles that up to your conscious brain as an emotion. You feel sad, you feel scared, you feel inexplicably excited about something that you really shouldn't be excited about, like this talk. And the problem that we then have is that we don't trust that. In order to respond to a situation based on emotion, it's like taking a leap of faith, a blind leap, and we're taught right from our whole scientific model, the way that we're educated, we're taught not to judge a book by its cover, not to make emotional decisions, think about the facts and that kind of thing. So it's really hard for us to say, well, that's valid. What I'm feeling is valid. Why is it valid? And process that through into your conscious decision-making process. Nice little experiment done here, the Iowa card experiment. So participants are given $2,000 of play money to start with, 4 decks of cards to choose from. Each round, what they had to do is pick a deck and turn over a card from, and that card either gave them a reward, which went into their pot money, or a penalty which came out of their pot of money. The decks were rigged. 2 of the decks were good decks. They gave you relatively low rewards, but also relatively low penalties. And 2 of the decks were bad decks. They gave you high rewards, but also big penalties. If you just played the good decks, then you would come out on top, generally speaking. It took 50 rounds before people started to favour the good decks. It took 80 rounds before they were consciously aware that they were doing that, before they thought to themselves, yeah, that's the one I want to pick from. What they did was they did it under lie detector conditions, again, to measure the emotional responses. And what they found was that participants' hands became nervous reaching for a bad deck after just 10 turns. So, by the numbers, their dopamine system was 8 times faster than their conscious mind, because it's picking up, it's a great illustration of this neuroplasticity, it's picking up on these subtle patterns that we're not aware of. And our structure of our brain is changing very, very rapidly in order to integrate those. There you go. Subtle patterns we're not consciously aware of. So, what I was saying about the more experience you develop, the more information you have to match patterns against. Firefighters, great stories of experienced firefighters walking into what looks like a relatively tame house fire, looking around and saying, get everybody out. Clearing the building just before it collapses because the seat of the fire was actually in the basement, under the floor, instead of in the kitchen where it looked like it was in. And consciously they didn't know why they were making that call. But on some level, they were recognising a situation that they'd been in before, and their brain was saying, get out. And because they had that experience and they trusted that emotion, they saved their own life and possibly others. Cricket players, I could talk about football and penalties, but I've all had enough of football over the last few weeks. I certainly have. So a fast bowl. It takes 300 milliseconds for the ball to travel from the bowler's hands to the crease. It takes 250 milliseconds for the batsman's muscles to initiate a shot. It takes 2 to 3 milliseconds for the signal to travel from your eye to your brain. And under perfect conditions, it takes about 20 milliseconds to respond to sensory stimulus. So what you've then got is about 25 milliseconds to compute all the variables and decide where the ball's going and how you need to hit it. That is plenty of time for the ball to smack you in the face. So how do batsmen ever hit a fast bowl? They're picking up on anticipatory cues from the run-up. They're watching the bowler as he approaches, features of his hand and arm as he approaches. Thin slicing, great example. They showed batsmen 1-second clips of a bowler's run-up, and the batsmen were able to quite accurately predict where that ball was going to go, how fast it was going to be going, just from that 1-second clip. So that idea that we can make a judgment from a very small amount of information that's very similar to the judgment we would make from a larger amount of information. Nice story about a radar operator in the First Gulf War, Lieutenant Commander Michael Riley. Basically saw a dot on a radar screen that made him feel nervous, and he didn't know why it made him feel nervous. It could have been an enemy missile heading towards an American battleship. It could have been a US jet heading back towards its aircraft carrier, because it was flying along the same flight path as he'd been watching American jets come back for weeks and weeks. He didn't know why, but he felt that it was wrong. He made a call to shoot it down, spent a few agonising hours while they counted in jets and tried to work out if he'd shot down an American jet or an enemy missile. It turned out it was an enemy missile. No one could figure out how he had known, because he had known. He didn't know how he knew. And it took a psychologist, Gary Klein, cognitive psychologist, to look at the recordings of the radar signal and find that what had happened, because the missile was flying lower than the jets normally flew, it took longer to appear on the radar than the jets had done. Now, Commander Riley wasn't consciously aware that it took a few seconds longer for that dot to appear on the radar screen, but his dopamine system was. It had spent so long watching these dots that it was able to pick up on that anomaly and communicate that to him. Something's wrong here, do something. So, real world applications. Stop talking about theory, Simon. Meeting new clients, quoting for jobs, deciding the best way to approach tasks. Just a few things that I've kind of picked up on. But think about your day-to-day life, the things that you do. Because as professionals, we've all got a wealth of experience of the things that we do. I'm not saying any of us are experts, I'm certainly not, but you have enough experience to make good, intuitive decisions about things. We develop a broad base of experience on which to base decisions. First impressions. Like it or not, we all do it. We all meet someone that we immediately click with, or we don't trust, or we just don't like, and we make that assessment and we don't really know why. I'm saying you should trust that, because it's a product of our supercomputer crunching the numbers, taking in a load of information, matching it to stuff in our experience, and feeding it back. We're picking up on tone of voice, subtle cues from body language. Now, I'm not advocating turning down work from everyone that you feel a little bit creepy. But it is worth being aware of those reactions, because perhaps your subconscious is telling you that something about this person reminds you of a nightmare client who you have blotted from your conscious mind because it was such a horrible experience. Nice little study done by a psychologist called Samuel Gosling. He looked at the big 5 personality dimensions. Apparently this is a thing in psychology, some of you may know. Extroversion. Is this person sociable or retiring? Are they fun-loving or reserved? Agreeableness. Are they trusting or suspicious? Helpful or uncooperative? Conscientiousness. Are they organised or disorganised? Self-disciplined or weak-willed? Emotional stability. Are they worried or calm, insecure or secure? An openness to new experiences. Are they imaginative or down to earth? Independent or conforming? What he did was he took a bunch of 80 college students and he asked their friends to fill out this big 5 questionnaire about their friends, and it turns out that they knew their friends quite well. They were able to, assess them quite accurately. Then what he did was he took some volunteers and he gave those volunteers 15 minutes to look round their dorm rooms, their college bedrooms, and answer a similar questionnaire that attempted to rate their everyday impressions on a scale of 1 to 5 for things. Is this person someone who tends to find fault with others? Do they do a thorough job? Are they talkative? What he found was that on extroversion and agreeableness, the friends were better. They knew their friends, which kind of makes sense. But on the other 3, the strangers were able to make quite accurate assessments about the kind of person that person was, based on just kind of looking around their bedrooms, which I think is really interesting. I know that sitting in a meeting room with a client isn't the same as looking around the bedroom, and I'm not advising you to break into their house and try and do that. And it would be nice to know if a client's agreeable, but if you can tell something about their conscientiousness, their emotional stability, and their openness to new experiences, which may well be, for example, are they willing to trust your professional opinion on something, even if it doesn't necessarily fit with what they thought you would do, then that's quite a good start in terms of telling whether you're going to get along with somebody, whether you're going to work well with them. quoting for jobs, one of my least favourite things of all time. Partly because it takes me away from what I love doing, partly because I dread underquoting or overquoting. But one of the guys that I work with, I have quite a wide circle of people that I work with and different things. Pete Thody is a guy who's a copywriter with probably 30 years plus experience, and we talk about the Thody number. He basically says, what does your gut tell you? He literally sticks his finger in the air and says, it's a 4-day job. And then you work back from that and you break it down. You break up the job as you would normally do when you're quoting for something, break it down into components. It's going to take about a day and a half and so on and so on. And what you generally end up with the Thody number is the number that you first thought of, or thereabouts. Now part of that is you've been led by the number you first thought of. But actually, part of it, I think, is the fact that you have the experience to intuitively know how long each bit's going to take and where the stumbling blocks are going to be, where the bits are where you're going to be able to reuse things that you've done before. And you know that very, very quickly. You don't have to do that process of breaking it down and looking at each element individually. I'm not saying that's not helpful, but trust that instinct. Tackling tasks. Big companies spend a lot of time and money trying to emulate small companies. It's trying to mirror the lean and intuitive ways that small companies and individuals do things and approach challenges. That's basically what Agile is. Agile is a way of trying to codify the instinctive way that experienced developers do things when they're not constrained by all of the stuff that comes with a big company. Your dopamine system knows where to start. An experienced developer or designer or marketeer or whatever has a whole pile of patterns in their dopamine system which have been formed by experience, and you can trust to tell you where to start and where the challenges will lie. How? Am I doing time? Yeah. Am I talking too fast? No. No one's fallen asleep yet. How can we integrate our instinctive responses in order to make better decisions? Don't just rely on one system or the other. Perfect decisions, neither wholly emotional or exclusively rational. Come from a balanced combination of the two. Be aware of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the two systems. Learn when it's wise to prefer one over the other. Different problems require different strategies. So it's about balance, it's about combination. How do we do that? Read books, I'll give you at the end. But also, it's about awareness. Don't overthink it. Studies have shown that trying to consciously explain our unconscious reactions often results in the worst of both worlds. We make bad decisions. There's a really interesting study done with posters. People were offered a choice of posters. There were a couple of fine art posters, Monet and Van Gogh, and then there were some amusing pictures of cats. One group was asked to just rate the ones that they liked. Like that one, don't like that one, 1 out of 10, 5 out of 10 or whatever. Another group was asked to explain why they liked them. I need to check the numbers here. So, of the people who were asked to choose instinctively, 95% of them chose the fine art ones. The second group was split 50-50, and the thinking goes that when we're asked to explain why we like something, to explain why it's funny, isn't it? The cat's sitting on the dog's head. It's brilliant. Much easier than trying to explain why you like that picture of a haystack. It's nice colours. So, what they found, what they said to people was, right, take the poster home, the one you've chosen, take it home, hang it on the wall, and then 3 weeks later they revisited it and they asked people if they still liked their choice. And 75% of people who'd chosen funny cat pictures regretted their choice. And that wasn't the case with the fine art posters of people who'd chosen on instinct rather than rational decision. There's a similar study with jams. They had 45 different jams which they got experts to rate based on 16 different categories, things like texture and flavour and tartness, sweetness. I don't know how you rate jam. What they then did was they took a sample. They took the 1st, the 11th, 22nd, 33rd, and 44th, and they asked non-experts to rate them, taste them, spread it on a bit of toast, and rate it. And what they found was that the non-experts, the choices correlated with the experts really strongly. 0.55 is the probability. A really strong correlation between the two. When they then asked people to explain why they had chosen to do it again and to explain why this one was their favourite and why this one wasn't as good, that correlation dropped to 0.11, so almost statistically insignificant. When people had to explain why, they made poorer decisions. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you might notice that one spread more easily, even though that's not really a big factor in whether a jam is good or not. You might notice that one had a chunky texture and think that that was a bad thing, to mark it down for that, rather than just choosing the one which you enjoy eating. We make poor decisions if we have to explain them. But it's still important to examine our emotional responses. So notice what's coming up. A process called metacognition, how we regulate our emotions, we think about our emotions, and regulate them as a result. If a feeling makes no sense when we examine it, perhaps it's a misfire. If we have a strong reaction to somebody and then we think about why we're having that strong reaction, maybe we realise that it's because they're wearing a hat that reminds us of something else that upsets us or whatever. So yeah, trust those emotions, but also be aware of them. Be aware of what they're saying to you. Avoid information overload. Too much information can overwhelm or mislead us. Some interesting stuff done with MRIs. 380 patients with back pain, and they split them into two groups. One group had x-rays, one group had MRIs, and then beyond that they were assigned to their doctors to do whatever. What they found was that those patients who had an MRI were much more likely to be diagnosed with a disc abnormality, be told by the doctors, found this thing on your spine that's not right and that's what's causing you pain. The great news is that the outcomes for all the patients, regardless of the group, was much the same. They got better over time. But the scary thing is those patients who had an MRI were much more likely to have more doctor visits, more medication, and they had a much higher chance of invasive surgery. Because the doctors had all this information, they were able to find something that didn't look right. But it's a case of information overload, because subsequent studies have shown that there's actually a poor correlation between back pain and disc abnormalities. So they did I think it's in New Zealand, they did a big study. They took 1,000 MRIs of people who were both healthy and in pain. They gave those MRI pictures to surgeons and asked them to assess whether those patients were in pain or not. And there was almost no correlation. You had patients with severe disc problems and no pain. You had patients with an otherwise, visually healthy spine who were in chronic pain. So the scary thing about this is that even when doctors know this, they know that information doesn't necessarily translate into pain. They still order the MRIs, they still want to gather as much information as possible because that seems like the right thing to do. And in fact, they're just overloading themselves with information. Great quote here from Professor of Clinical Rehab at New York University Med Center. You have well-meaning doctors making structural diagnoses despite serious lack of evidence that these abnormalities are really causing the chronic pain. It's amazing how perfectly intelligent people will make foolish decisions if you give them lots of irrelevant stuff to consider. Very easy to overload yourself with information. Be aware of the glitches. Despite its refinement, the emotional brain still has its glitches. It's not perfect. I mentioned gambling earlier. Can cause the dopamine system to misfire. When we play games of random chance, our dopamine system is trying to match patterns in order to repeat the experience, and there are no patterns there to match, so it gets caught in this loop. And combine that with the excitement that I talked about at the beginning of an unexpected experience and how that fires the brain up. When you win at roulette or on a fruit machine, it fires the dopamine system right up and it wants to do it all over again. And it can't, because it can't match those patterns. Loss aversion is a really, really interesting thing. The brain desperately tries to avoid loss. We measure loss much more than, how do I put this? It can override a rational analysis. So, give you an example. A study was done where a hypothetical situation presented to doctors about a disease outbreak. There's a rare Asian disease that's about to break out in this country, and 600 people will die. We've got two programs that we can use to address this. One program, program A, 200 people will be saved. Program B, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. And what they found, I was going to do a show of hands, but there's not really enough people. What they found was that 72% of people went for option A, that certainty of saving 200 people, rather than the gamble of the 33% probability that they could save everybody. They then reran it. With program C, 400 people will die. Program D, there's a 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. So mathematically, they're exactly the same. The numbers are exactly the same. What they've done is to frame it differently. You're saving people, or people are dying. And the percentage is flipped. 28% of doctors, 28% of doctors then went for option C. They were much more likely to take the gamble than they were to go for the certainty, just purely because of that flipping it round from saving people to people dying, because it kicks in loss aversion within the brain. The brain's going, we've got to avoid that thing. And so it's so keen to avoid loss that it tends to reject a guaranteed gain in favour of a questionable gamble. Unconscious biases, we're stuffed with these. We don't even know we're doing it. So they're really interesting tests. You can do them online. IAT, implicit association test, and it's done in the format of you're shown an image and you have to pick one of two options very quickly. And because it's done on a computer, it can measure it down to the millisecond of how quickly you react. The race IAT is very interesting in that I think something like 80% of people carry implicit racial biases, which are completely at odds with our stated conscious preferences. The way that the IAT works is, I'm going to try and explain it, but it's very interesting because it reveals these unconscious biases that we don't even know are there. Have a look at it. Look out. It's really interesting. Priming. Our brains can be primed to react a certain way, again, in an unconscious way that we're not even aware of. So, great little study. People are given groups of 5 words jumbled up, and you have to make a four-word grammatically correct sentence out of them. So you've got, him was worried she always, shoes give replace old the, he will sweat lonely they, sky the same as grey is, should now withdraw forgetful we, as bingo sing play let. And so you construct sentences from those. And what they did a study with I think it was university students. And what you've got in here is you've got these words like worried, old, lonely, grey, forgetful, bingo, words that are implicitly priming us to think about being old. And we're not aware of them. When we are aware of them, it doesn't work. But when we're not consciously aware of them, they affect our behaviour. So the students, when they left the room where the test was done, they walked much more slowly than they did when they did groups of words which didn't have the same implicit associations in. So this priming thing is really pernicious, because you just don't know it's happening. I missed one, wrinkle. Simple problems require reason, complex problems require trust. One of the biggest decisions we ever make is usually done on feel. Shane Kingsley's not here because he pointed this one out. You buy a house. You spend an awful lot of time, it's got to have 3 to this, and I really want a garage, and I want so on and so on. And then you walk into a house and you go, this is it, this is the one, buy it. And all of that computation goes out the window because it feels right. Choosing a car or a vegetable peeler based on a limited number of variables is possible. Vegetable peeler is a great example because price, is it sharp, does it feel solid in your hands? There's a relatively small number of vegetables. Studies done with choosing cars, what they did was they asked people to choose a car based on a fairly small number of variables, boot size, fuel efficiency and so on. And they geared it up so that one of the cars was objectively best, and people made good decisions if they had to choose based on that. If they then took it and broadened it and asked them to choose in a much more realistic situation with lots of different variables, if people tried to compute the variables, they made much poorer decisions, and the way they test that decision, they revisit people like with the posters, they revisit them a few months later and, are you still happy with this car? Really? When we get prefrontal cortex cannot cope with lots of variables. If we get given lots of variables, our conscious mind tends to fixate on one or two which might or might not be important to our long-term enjoyment of that thing.
So why I can never choose something in a restaurant?
Yes.
Right, good. Okay.
I'll come to that in a minute. There you go. But take in all the information, walk away, let it all ferment, literally sleep on it, let your subconscious crunch all the numbers, process all the variables, and then come back to it and just go, that one, chicken chow mein. Yeah. A variation of that poster study done by a Dutch psychologist. Anybody Dutch any good? I'm not going to try and pronounce that. No. What he did was he showed people the posters, then he distracted them for 7 minutes with anagrams, and then he said, choose the poster you like, just pick it. And it worked much better. People chose things that 3 months later they were still happy with, that they still loved, because they hadn't tried too hard to think about it. Great quote here from a book of samurai wisdom. Matters of great concern should be treated lightly, matters of small concern should be treated seriously. And that's exactly the same thing. When you've got a simple decision to make, look at the information, crunch the numbers consciously and decide. You've got a big decision to make, think about it, don't forget about it, and then when it comes to it, make a light decision. Just go. That's what feels right. Focus on your mistakes. When things go wrong, prediction error signals that I talked about earlier, in neurological terms, we learn more when things go wrong. Our emotions are intelligent because they translate our mistakes into educational events. Disappointment of failure is much more powerful than the joy of success. Even when things have gone right, analyse and work out what you could have done better, because you might find there's something there. Niels Bohr, the physicist, said an expert is a person who's made all the mistakes that can be made in a very narrow field. Now, I'm certainly not saying I'm an expert. Probably none of us are experts in our particular field, but that doesn't mean we don't have a whole pile of expertise that, again, you can use to match and pattern match and make decisions. There's no shortcut to becoming an expert. You've got to make the mistakes. I've made a few. But once you've made those mistakes and you've formed those patterns, that basis of experience, it's important to trust your emotions because they're telling you something that's valid. Embrace uncertainty, like this one. Listen to advice, accept you could be wrong, remind yourself of what you don't know, because certainty can be a trap. Colin Powell, talking to intelligence officers, tell me what you know, tell me what you don't know, only then tell me what you think. Always keep those three separated. Crew resource management, CRM, developed by airlines for use in the cockpit, based on a study done by NASA. And what they found was that cockpit errors, whether they led to accidents or not, were very often caused by the godlike certainty of the pilot. There's a quote about a pilot who was an arrogant SOB. They had a problem with the landing gear. It looked like the landing gear hadn't gone down because the light didn't come on, and they changed the bulbs, and they went through the manual, and all the time this was going on, one of the crew was saying to the pilot, we're running out of fuel, and he wouldn't listen because he knew what he was doing, and it was going to be fine, and it ended up the plane crash landing in the field because it ran out of fuel. So CRM was developed and implemented following that crash, and what it does is it encourages everybody, regardless of the seniority within the team, to express their concerns. It will break with anybody that travels on the tube or on the train, but the motto of CRM is see it, say it, fix it. And it works. Nebraska Medical Center implemented CRM within their surgical program, and what they did was they taught people to speak up, whether it was before surgery, whether it was during surgery. They got them involved in post-op debriefings, so everybody said, yeah, but you did this, and I think if you'd done that, would have gone differently. And what they found was after only 6 months, the percentage of people who felt free to question those with more authority rose from 29 to 86%. But they also had a dramatic decrease in medical mistakes. So the percentage of uneventful cases, i.e. surgeries that went to plan with no hiccups, went from 21% to 62%. So they basically tripled their success rate in terms of uneventful surgeries that went to plan. Because CRM deters certainty and it stimulates debate. Get people in your teams involved, and maybe I don't have a team of people that work for me, but I have a group of people who I work with, and I will pick up the phone or Skype to someone and say, this is what I'm thinking, what do you reckon? And let someone shoot me down, because when someone shoots you down, it makes you think differently about it, and you have to accept that you could be wrong. Above all, think about thinking. The single most important thing you take away from today, think about thinking. Study your brain at work. Be aware of what's coming up and ask yourself where it's coming from. So it's saying, are you just having a bad response to that bad hat that so-and-so wore when you were a kid and you fell off the, whatever it is. Be aware of the potential glitches. I've given you some of them today. If you're at all interested, read the books, because 2 of them are really readable, really enjoyable, and really interesting. Know that overthinking complex decisions can result in bad decisions. Don't get fooled into thinking that more information means better decisions. There's no secret recipe, only vigilance. Watch your brain, watch what it's doing, know what it's doing, and make good decisions. So, what's going on in the nervous system when we make snap judgment? A whole bunch of complicated yet largely reliable processing. Why should we give more credence to our intuitive responses? Because it's very efficient, by and large pretty accurate. How can we integrate our instinctive responses in order to make better decisions? By being more conscious of our unconscious and, of course, trusting our instincts. Read books. Thanks very much. Questions?
Yeah.
Lots.
Is it a cultural thing, do you think? Western brains, Eastern brains, Scotsman, Englishman? Is there a difference between how we...
I don't know, but probably, yeah. Yeah. You're probably bang on the money there. Be interesting to see, because I think a lot of these things, particularly the East-West split, it is really key in the way that these kinds of things are approached.
As a French Canadian who lives in England, I'm definitely sure that it is a cultural thing. It works in all 3 countries, and definitely it's a different way of people making decisions. Definitely trusting their instincts in different ways.
So what the French kind of promotional, continental...
A bit, but they do tend to overthink things and rehash and work really, really long hours to make sure and just rewrite things and check and check and check. And I think in the UK people are a bit more, as you say, asking people and discussing things and calling each other, what more, it feels more like a feeling sometimes
Okay.
in the UK. Yeah, the French tend to rehash a lot and so having so much information to try and make a certain decision. I feel it more like that, less as you say, of a rash.
Okay. Interesting.
But more emotional here in some way.
Is there like some sort of methodology you use or something to sort of be checking for your emotional response to things? Because I think most of the time I'm completely oblivious to what my emotional response is to things. I kind of, you know, or no, I am. I don't think, oh, I did that because I felt such and such.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I have to say, like that last section, that's kind of been the icing on the cake in terms of my thinking about all this, and so that's relatively new to me. So, do I have a methodology? No. But are there methodologies? Are there ways of doing it? Yeah, almost certainly. But I think, like so many things, the awareness is the first step. Knowing that this stuff is going on is the first thing. You will probably find yourself in a couple of days' time or a week's time thinking, oh, is that thing that Simon's... Oh, he was talking rubbish, and actually that just happened. So,
I'm laughing worried all the time whether you can trust your gut instinct or oh, is this a glitch?
yeah. But I would argue that, you know, it's based on solid neurology, and I'm not saying you should make all your decisions on, you know, by gut feel and the seat of your pants, but at the same time,
I love the bit where you
Yeah.
said if you think too much about complex decisions, you can make poorer decisions. I get moaned out. I have been in the past. I'm really analytical,
right,
and I will talk about something emotional, and I say, well, why did I feel like that? And,
Mm.
and I try and understand it. And then I try and talk about one, and it's like I don't understand what you're talking about.
yeah.
And
So you can go around the circle.
and I think maybe you can, because maybe perhaps you can't always actually, you know, using your bit that's up there, you know, you can't always get down there
No.
to understand. You just get that, and it's come, as you say, from years of experiences that you've probably forgotten. And, you know, you just think, no, this is good or bad, or I have a fun feeling or whatever it is. And I want to go in. Well, why is that? What's that?
Yeah. And
Particularly if I don't like it. You know,
Yeah.
I think, oh, that's negative. So
Yeah.
have I got something wrong?
Yeah.
You know.
And that's the thing, you know, there is no perfect decision. You can kind of weigh it all up, and you can analyse all the variables till the cows come home. But you know, sometimes you just got to jump one way or the other, and that's hard. It's hard when you know, particularly if you are, because I'm like that. You know, I'm an analytical person. It's hard to just trust and just go with something.
So I'm just not going to worry about it.
Yeah.
Just do something.
But you mentioned about you know, like the film that you watched. Is it also? I don't know if you know this, but is that true? Is everything you've remembered there somewhere, and you've just lost that connection?
Yeah, I don't know a great deal about memory, and memory I think is one of those things where our understanding has changed quite a lot, particularly over the last 5 or
But
10
you
years.
mentioned it was expensive to keep those connections going. So is there like a finite? You know, you've got so many of these things you can remember, and then you have to let go of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you know, your brain is working with a limited amount of energy and a limited amount of cellular matter, and if it's the same as muscles. If you don't use muscles, it's expensive to maintain those muscles, and your body will break them down in order to use that fuel elsewhere. Your body's very efficient at being lazy.
That's one thing.
So yeah, as I understand it, your brain will break down neurons into neurons. They're called the decision makers, the neurons that connect to other neurons and enable us to do that, if this then that thing. Your brain will break them down if it's not using them, but then at the same time, cells oligodendocytes, I think, going around rebuilding neurons and connections, and that happens really, really fast. That's the thing that fascinates me. Literally within the case of the example I've seen is it's like a library book for which the index file has been lost, or a section on the hard drive that the index has been deleted for. The information's still there. It's just it needs to be located. Yeah.
So I was going to ask, can you teach your gut? Because you can pick up a book and pick up some analytic things in
or is it just kind of like humming away in the background?
I guess you teach it through experience.
So you're kind of like, actively, like consciously do it. It sounds like it's something that's
Good
running in
question.
the background itself. But
Yeah, good question.
Maybe through reflection. If you went on your gut and something that works, reflect on that.
okay,
Yeah.
so like here being the meta,
Yeah,
essentially
Yeah.
analysing your own.
yeah. Analysing.
Surely any life experience you have is teaching your gut.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Just being
Because it's
around.
going in and it's being assimilated, so you have it.
So have more experiences.
Have more
perhaps,
experiences.
yeah.
Yeah. Let your dopamine system record those
Yeah.
experiences.
Give it lots of information and somehow.
Yeah.
You could kind of say force yourself to take on new experiences where some people
Yeah,
really kind of hold back and go, I don't like certain things. You kind of force yourself, right? Let's try a lot of things that you normally do, and you're kind of
Try electrocuting yourself every time you
There's a really interesting study about novelty. If you want to live longer, you should take a different route to work every day.
Okay.
Because you end up, if you do the same thing again and again and again, it's really boring. So if you
Yeah.
sit around home and do nothing at all, but if you force yourself to do something novel, you will feel like you've had an experience. You know, like feel like I had a fuller weekend.
Yeah. Maybe you form new connections in your brain.
Yeah, because your brain's just continually mapping new
Yeah.
things.
If you do the same things over and over again, you just use the same neural pathways.
Yeah.
And I guess that.
I guess that sort of explains.
David Eagleman did that. Take different routes to work to do the same thing, to make his life more novel.
Like, I guess that kind of explains why when you do the same route of work every day, you can't remember half the time how you got to work because you've done it so many times.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a routine. Yeah.
Ask Mark if you want the slides or just a list of books. Decisive Moment and Blink particularly, really good books. Really readable. Blink is Malcolm Gladwell, who's the tipping point guy, and it's a brilliant book because you can read it in a few days, and it's very concise, and it's got lots of things in it. You go, what? Thinking Fast and Slow is really good, but it's denser. I've actually been rereading it because I started reading it, and my brother asked me if I had it, and I said, yeah, I've got it, yeah. And I picked it up and I went, oh, I got to page 36. So he read it, and I've got it back now, and I'm rereading it, and going, oh god, yeah, that's really good. But maybe read the other two first, because then it'll give you the basis to really get your teeth into that one. I thoroughly recommend reading it. Yeah, that was my argument. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Mark, for the opportunity.
Thank you.